checkups for our own health, right? Blood pressure, fitness, all the basics. But have you ever stopped to think, what if you could give an entire country a health checkup? How would you even begin to do that?
It's a pretty huge question, isn't it? It's not like you can just put a stethoscope on a nation and listen to its heartbeat. So how do the experts, the public health folks, get a clear, objective picture of what's really going on with the health of an entire community?
Well, the answer lies in this really cool set of tools called health indicators. The best way to think about them is like lab results or maybe even x-rays, but for an entire population. They give us the hard data we need.
Hey there. So we all get checkups for our own health, right? Blood pressure, fitness, all the basics. But have you ever stopped to think, what if you could give an entire country a health checkup? How would you even begin to do that?
It's a pretty huge question, isn't it? It's not like you can just put a stethoscope on a nation and listen to its heartbeat. So how do the experts, the public health folks, get a clear, objective picture of what's really going on with the health of an entire community?
Well, the answer lies in this really cool set of tools called health indicators. The best way to think about them is like lab results or maybe even x-rays, but for an entire population. They give us the hard data we need to peek under the hood and see what's really happening.
Doctor checks your pulse and your temperature. These indicators, they're basically a nation's vital signs. They give us that quick but super essential snapshot of its overall health.
And if we break it down, a health indicator, at its core, is really just a single variable. It's one piece of data that acts as a clue. It points towards a much, much larger truth about the health of an entire community.
But of course, it's never just one clue, right? To get the full picture, you need a whole dashboard of these things. Each indicator is measuring a totally different piece of the puzzle that makes up a community's health.
And just look at how comprehensive this dashboard is. We're talking about everything from mortality, that's death, and morbidity, sickness, all the way to things like nutritional status, environmental factors, even social and mental health, the whole shebang. Now, for this explainer, we're going to zoom in on two really powerful examples to show you how this works.
All right, so let's dive in with one of the most fundamental indicators out there, mortality. Yeah, death rates. I know, it sounds a little grim, but trust me, what these numbers reveal is incredibly powerful.
Okay, look at this number, 28. Let's say this represents a hypothetical infant mortality rate, or IMR for short. What this means is that for every 1,000 babies born alive in a community, 28 of them died before their first birthday. That's a single, really stark piece of data.
So, why is this one number so important? Here's the thing. This isn't just a statistic about babies. Not at all. This single number unlocks a much, much deeper story about the entire community. A high IMR like that, it usually suggests three big things. First, it could mean the overall health of the entire population isn't great. Second, it often points to some really tough socioeconomic conditions, things like poverty or a lack of education. And third, and this is a big one, it's a direct reflection of the healthcare system itself. We're talking its quality, how easy it is to access, and how effective it is. So yeah, one number is telling three absolutely huge stories. But here's the thing. As our understanding of health has gotten more sophisticated, we're realizing that just counting how long people live, well, it isn't enough. And that brings us to a much more modern way of thinking about well-being.
And this shift in focus, it's absolutely crucial. We've basically moved from just measuring lifespan to measuring what we call health span. See, it's not just about adding more years to your life, it's about adding more life to your years. And to measure that, you need a totally different kind of indicator.
And that indicator is called the Disability Adjusted Life Year, or DALY for short. The whole goal here is to measure the total burden of a disease on a population. It's a way to calculate all the years of healthy life that are lost, either because someone died too early or because they're living with some kind of disability or illness. So let me break it down for you. It's actually pretty straightforward. A DALY is basically made of two parts. First, you've got the years of life lost. That's pretty simple. It's from dying prematurely. Then you have the years lived with disability, which measures the time people spend living in less than perfect health. You just add those two together, and bam, you get a single number that shows the total impact of a disease or an injury. Okay, so we've got all this data now, right? We've got IMR, we've got dailies, and dozens of other indicators. But so what? What's the actual point of all this? How do these numbers on a spreadsheet actually lead to real-world action?
This right here is where it all comes together. This is the why. Governments use these indicators to build smart, effective health policies. They use them to decide where to put precious funding and resources. Does this region need more maternal care, or does that one need better ways to manage chronic disease? It lets us compare health between different countries, pinpoint groups that are getting left behind, and, super importantly, monitor whether our health programs are actually doing what they're supposed to do.
Because at the end of the day, it is so important to remember that behind every single one of these statistics, there's a human story. These numbers aren't just cold data points on a chart. No way. They are stories about a community's well-being, its biggest challenges, and also its greatest strengths.
So that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. These indicators are an incredibly powerful lens for understanding the world around us. So the next time you see a health statistic in the news, I really want you to ask yourself, what bigger story is this one little number really trying to tell me? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.
All the time, right? But what are we really talking about? I mean, if you think it's just about not being sick, well, you're in for a surprise. Turns out there's a much bigger and honestly a way more interesting picture. So let's dive in.
All right, so let me ask you this, straight up. If you're not coughing, you don't have a fever, does that mean you're healthy? Like, truly healthy?
For most of us, the gut reaction is yeah, of course, right? But that's only one tiny piece of this giant puzzle. Thinking health is just about not being sick. It's like finding one puzzle piece on the floor and saying you finished the whole 1,000-piece set. It just doesn't work that way. So today, we're going to start putting all those other pieces together.
Okay, to really get this, we've got to look at the official definition. And it's built on these three, let's call them pillars, that are going to completely change how you think about being well. All right, so check this out. It breaks down into three main ideas. First, health is a state of complete well-being, and that's not just physical, but mental and social too. Second, and this is the real game changer, it's not just about not being sick. You could be physically fine, but if you're super stressed out or feeling lonely, well, according to this, you're not actually in a state of complete health. And finally, it even includes being able to live a productive life, both in your community and your work.
So there you have it. It's a totally different way of looking at things, isn't it? It's a positive, active state. It's not just a meh, I'm not sick kind of thing. It's about thriving, not just surviving. And honestly, this idea is the foundation for everything else we're going to talk about.
Okay, so we've got these pillars: physical, mental, social. But how does that actually play out in real life? Well, you can think of it like peeling back the layers of an onion. They branch out into these different, connected dimensions that make up who we are. Of course, you've got the big three we just mentioned: physical, mental, and social. But it goes way deeper than that. We're also talking about our spiritual and emotional health. And get this, it even includes our vocational health. Yep, your job, your career. That's a huge piece of your well-being. Let's take a closer look at a couple of these, because they're pretty interesting.
All right, let's talk about social health, because this one is so important today. This is not about your follower count. It's not about how many friends you have on some app. It's about the quality, the realness of your connections with actual people in the real world. Your involvement in your community. It's all about that genuine, human connection. Spiritual health is another one that people get mixed up all the time. Let's be clear, this does not have to be about religion. It can be, but it's really about your personal search for meaning, your purpose. It's about figuring out that big why that gets you out of bed in the morning. Having that sense of purpose, it's a massive part of being truly well. And then there's vocational health. See, I had told you this concept was broad. This is all about feeling fulfilled and satisfied by your work. I mean, think about it. A job that makes you feel good, that feels stable, that has a huge effect on your mental state, which in turn affects your physical state. It's all connected, a total web. So we have all these different parts of ourselves, these dimensions of health. But what actually shapes them? What makes them better or worse? Well, that's where we get into what are called the determinants of health. Basically, all the things that, determine how healthy we can be. And it's a real mix of stuff. We're talking about our genetics, the choices we make every day, the environment we live in, our financial situation, and even whether we can get to a doctor. So it's a combination of things we can control and, well, things we can't. Let's kick off with biology and genetics. This one's pretty easy to grasp, right? It's the hand you're dealt.
For example, if something like diabetes runs in your family, that's a biological factor that influences your own health risks. Simple as that. Okay, next up, our behaviors, our lifestyle. And what's really fascinating here is how this plays out differently all over the world. In a lot of developed countries, the big health problems come from things like sitting around too much and eating a lot of junk food. But then you look at developing nations, and the issues are often way more fundamental. Things like poor hygiene, lack of clean water, and just not getting enough food. So it's the same category, lifestyle, but the challenges are totally different depending on where you live. Now, this is a big one. It turns out some of the most powerful things that determine your health have nothing to do with your body itself. We're talking about your socioeconomic status, things like how much money you make, your level of education, your job. These are incredibly powerful predictors of how healthy you'll be.
And within that, there's a saying that goes something like, when you educate a woman, you educate a whole family. And it's so true when it comes to health. Why? Because very often, an educated woman becomes the main person looking after the health of her entire family. She's the one making choices about food, about cleanliness, about when it's time to see a doctor. Her knowledge quite literally lifts up the health of everyone she cares for.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second. When you put all this together, all those different dimensions of well-being, and all those forces, both inside and outside of us, that shape them, you start to see it, right? Health isn't just some simple personal thing. It's this huge, complex, interconnected system. And that brings us to what I think is the most important takeaway of all. Health isn't the goal. It's the fuel. It's the resource you need to live your life, to learn, to work, to have relationships, to do all the things you want to do. It's not the destination. It's the vehicle that gets you there. So I'm going to leave you with a question to chew on. Now that you know health is so much more than just the physical side of things, what's one other part of your health, maybe your social, your vocational, even your spiritual health, that you can just check in on today? Just give it a little thought. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.
Something really fascinating from India. It's a tool that tries to do something huge, put an actual number on a family's social class. It's called the Kupuswamy scale, and it's this widely used system for figuring out socioeconomic status. You've got to see how this works.
But that brings up the big question, right? How do you even begin to measure something as complicated as social class? I mean, it's not just about how much money you have. It's this whole messy web of your education, your job, what opportunities you have. So how do you boil all of that down to just one number? Well, that's the exact problem the Kupuswamy scale was built to tackle. So here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about what the scale is for. Then, we'll get into its 3 key ingredients. We'll see how the scoring system works, turning life into numbers, and then we'll walk through a real example to see it in action. After we get our result, we'll figure out what it means. And finally, we'll talk about why any of this matters in the first place. Okay, so first things first, what's its purpose? The Kupuswamy scale was designed specifically with urban India in mind. The goal was to create a consistent way for researchers and policymakers to measure and compare socioeconomic status so that everyone's using the same ruler, so to speak. Basically, its whole purpose is to give us a standard method to classify families. Instead of just winging it with gut feelings or vague descriptions, this scale gives us a systematic process, and that's absolutely crucial if you want to do fair, accurate research or plan social programs that actually work. So how does this thing actually tick? Well, you can think of it kind of like an investigator's toolkit. To figure out a family's socioeconomic status, it zooms in on 3 key pieces of evidence. And here they are: education, occupation, and income. Pretty standard stuff, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. It's whose education and occupation the scale actually looks at. It focuses on just one key person in the entire household. And that key person is called the head of the family, usually the main breadwinner or the one calling the shots. Now, this is critical. The scores for both education and occupation are based only on that one person. The third piece, income, is different. That's calculated based on the total monthly family income divided by how many people live in the house. And get this, there's a really clever way to remember these 3 things, and it's hidden right in the name Kupuswamy. K is for kam, which means occupation. P is for pade, which means education. And MY is for, you guessed it, money or income. Pretty neat, right? It's a great little trick. All right, let's get to the really juicy stuff. How you turn these clues into actual numbers.
This is where you can really see the logic of the scales start to come alive. Each of those three components gets its own special scoring table. First up, education. And this one's super straightforward. It's basically a simple ladder from 1 to 7. If the head of the family is illiterate, they get a score of 1. If they have a professional degree, like a doctor or an engineer, they get the top score of 7. The more schooling, the higher the score. Easy enough.
Okay, now for occupation. This one also feels like a ladder. At first, it follows a similar kind of system, but there is a huge, and I mean huge, twist right at the very top. It doesn't follow that same neat 1 to 7 pattern we just saw.
Okay, so take a look at this. The scores are climbing pretty normally, 1, 2, 3, up to 6, but then bam, it leaps all the way to 10 for professional. This isn't just a small step up. The scale is basically screaming that certain jobs, like doctors, engineers, senior managers, have a massive outsized impact on a family's socioeconomic standing.
But if you thought that jump was a little weird, just wait till you see the income scoring. This is where the whole system gets, well, kind of quirky. The scores aren't sequential at all, and these income brackets get updated every so often to keep up with inflation. Just look at that score column. It's not a nice, neat progression at all, is it? It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it skips right over 5 and jumps to 6, then to 10, and then all the way to 12? What this tells us is that the scale thinks that once you cross certain income lines, you're not just earning a bit more money, you're making a huge leap into a different social reality.
All right, enough with the theory and the tables. Let's make this real. We're going to take an example straight from the source material and actually calculate a score, step by step, from scratch.
So let's meet our guy. He's a painter. He tells us he's studied up to the 8th grade, he works as a painter, and his family earns about 10,000 rupees a month. Okay, so we've got our 3 clues. Now let's do the math. Okay, let's break this down. First, education. He made it to 8th grade, so that puts him in the middle school category. Looking at our table, that's a score of 3. Next, occupation. A painter is considered a skilled worker, and that earns him a score of 4. Finally, income. 10,000 rupees a month falls into the bracket that gets a score of 3.
And now we just add them up. We've got 3 plus 4 plus 3, which gives us a grand total score of 10. So we have our number, but what on earth does a 10 actually mean?
And that brings us to the grand finale, the verdict. We take that total score of 10 and we check it against one last table to find out the family's official socioeconomic class, according to the scale. So if we look at this final chart, a total score of 10 lands our painter's family right here, in the upper lower class category. And notice how specific that is. It's not just lower class. The scale recognizes different tiers within that broader group. And you know, these fine-tuned distinctions are really what make the scales so powerful. The gap between someone who scores, say, in the upper middle class versus the lower middle class isn't just a number. It reflects real, measurable differences in their income, the prestige of their job, and their level of education. The scale creates these sharp boundaries where we might otherwise just see a blurry line. So we've seen how the sausage gets made. We know how to calculate the score. But why? Why go through all this trouble? What's the point of putting a number on all of this in the first place?
Well, it turns out this scale is a massive deal in the real world. Public health researchers, they use it all the time to see how diseases might affect different economic groups. Sociologists use it to map out how communities are structured. And policymakers, you bet, they rely on it to make sure aid programs are actually reaching the people who need the most. It's even used in clinical trials to make sure the people being tested are a diverse group. It provides hard data for incredibly important decisions. And that really brings us to the final big picture thought here. The Kupaswamy scale is, without a doubt, a really clever and useful tool for turning a complex social reality into a number you can work with. But it also makes you wonder, right? Can one single number, no matter how carefully it's calculated, ever really capture the full story of a family's life, their struggles, their hopes, their aspirations? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for digging into this with me.